Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. In most of this week, we have been talking about different aspects and approaches towards problem solving. In the last lecture of the week, I will very briefly touch upon one of the topics that is slightly linked to problem solving, but is also a very important topic in its own right: creativity. Now, what is creativity? We will talk about definitions at some point, but you can just pause and look around. Who are the people that you consider as creative? Inventors, authors, actors, poets, so on and so forth. People who have some qualities that are identifiably very different from all the other people around them. What are these qualities? What are the salient features of people who are considered creative? If you observe them, if you observe how they go about things, go about doing things, how they think, how they approach problems, how they solve particular problems, are in some sense different from how ordinary people solve problems. Also, what are these people doing that others are not? Why are these people very successful? Why are their solutions more impactful? Why are their solutions quicker, considered more ingenious than the solutions that come through ordinary thinking, that come through thinking of normal common individuals? So, some of these questions you can ask yourself. I will very briefly touch, or I will very briefly kind of circle around these questions, and let us we will talk about how creativity is a very important cognitive activity. Now, to talk about definitions, there is almost no standardized definition of creativity, and the theoretical approaches taken to study it are very diverse. There is almost no agreement on what creativity actually is, and there is almost no agreement on what is the best approach to study creativity. Different people have defined creativity in different ways, different people adopt different paradigms to measure and assess creativity, and this is how the field is structured. And even though there is so much of controversy, even though there is so much of agreement, disagreement, discussion and debate about what is creative, what is not, who is creative, who is not, what does it constitute being creative, the topic is very popular. There are multiple books written, there are multiple papers published on the topic of creativity. Even in the decade of 2000s, a lot of books were published on creativity. Now, just kind of observing and examining this topic, many theorists have proposed that novelty is a very important or almost a necessary component of creativity. So, a creative person should come up with solutions that are novel and that have not been offered before. That is one way of looking at it. Other than the fact that the solution is novel, a creative solution must be useful as well and must be appropriate as well. I was reading through one of these books, and a very interesting example is that if the question is how would you roast a pig, Charles Lamb in the 19th century observes that one of the ways to roast a pig would be to put the pig in the house and burn down the house. That is also a way to roast the pig, but is it a useful solution? Is it an appropriate solution? So, even novel solutions should be qualified with other criteria like these, and only then you can actually definitively say that this is a creative solution. Also, there is disagreement amongst psychologists about the characteristics of creative thinking. For example, whether it arises out of ordinary thinking, methodical, step by step kind of thinking that we have been seeing in the past couple of weeks, or it involves some kind of extraordinary way of thinking of solutions, extraordinary way of concocting solutions out of thin air. How do creative people think? What are their ways, or what are their methods of churning up solutions? So, there is a lot of debate there as well. I will just briefly touch upon two approaches. One of the approaches was put forward by Guilford back in the 1960s, and Guilford proposed that creativity should be measured in terms of divergent production. How many different solutions, how many different responses can one give to each test item? So, it has been proposed that creativity requires divergent thinking rather than coming up with just one single best answer. You should be able to flexibly think of so many different kinds of responses to whatever test item, whatever question is posed in front of you. It makes a little bit of a sense, it's not completely a bad idea. It's obviously, say for example, if somebody is intelligent, if somebody is witty enough, they can actually come up with a variety of responses to the same question, and that is certainly can be considered creative. But say for example, let us take an example, one of the tests that Guilford used, he basically gave these participants tests, and somebody who scores high on these kind of tests must have been must need to explore the solutions in a creative fashion, and they will get a high score on this test and they will be considered more creative. So, the demonstration is like divergent production test would be something like this. Many words begin with an L and an N. In 1 minute, list as many words as possible that have the form L beginning and end, N till the end. The words can have any number of letters between L and N. So, you can you have to come up with so many words, as many words as possible in just 1 minute. Then the other problem is, suppose that people reach their final height at the age of 2. So, the normal adult height would be less than 3 feet. In 1 minute, list as many consequences as possible that would result from this change. How much can you think? How divergent you can think? This will happen, this will happen, this will happen, and you can have to give in just 1 minute how many different things that are possible. Below, another problem could be, below is a list of names. So, Sally, Maya, Harold and Beth, and what you have to do is, you have to say Beth, Gail and Joan, and what you have to do is, you have to arrange these names in as many orders as possible, in as many ways as possible in just 1 minute. One of the ways could be, you could just use a number of syllables, you could use number of letters, you could use male names, female names, so many things you can do. The fourth problem is that there are 4 shapes here, and in 1 minute you have to combine them to make each of the following objects: a face, a lamp, a piece of playground equipment and a tree. Each shape may be used once, many times or not at all in forming each object, and it may be expanded or shrunk to any size. Each shape may also be rotated. So, there is a lot of freedom there, and you have to just use these 4 shapes to make up whatever requirements have been placed before you. Now, depending upon what kind of responses people come up with, and depending upon different people coming up with different ranges of responses, one can actually give them a score on divergent thinking. Somebody can come up with 500 solutions to one of these problems in 1 minute, and the other person can just come up with 200 solutions, then you would obviously assume that the person coming up with 500 solutions is more creative. Research on tests of divergent thinking have found moderate correlation between people's test scores and other judgment of creativity. So, it has been in some sense, in a moderate sense, shown that people who achieve higher score on these tests of divergent production are considered creative by other tests as well. However, the number of different ideas may not be the best measure of creativity, and that has basically been repeated in a lot of other studies as well. Because this measure does not really assess, and it does not really give you the idea about whether the number of ideas that you are generating are all novel or appropriate or useful. So, they are, how effective those ideas are is not really just measured by number of ideas. So, there could be other tests of creativity as well. Let us talk about a different theory of creativity, investment theory of creativity. Now, Sternberg and colleagues propose that creative people who deal in the world of ideas also they behave a little bit like investors. When nobody is buying the stock, buy a lot of it, and when everybody is interested in that, just sell it off and move to something else. So, creative people, according to Sternberg and colleagues, produce a creative idea when no one else is interested in the investment. As soon as a lot of people start getting interested in the same ideas, they leave that and they move to newer pastures. So, according to Sternberg and Lubart's investment theory of creativity, the essential attributes of creativity are 6. They are intelligence, knowledge, motivation, an encouraging environment, an appropriate thinking style, and also an appropriate personality. To work creatively, you must possess all 6 of these things. If you are missing on any one of or any 2 of these different attributes, you will not be considered creative. So, if Sternberg and Lubert design a test, it would measure all 6 of these things, and a combination of scores of all 6 of these attributes would give you a certificate of creativity or not. Now, this is also an interesting approach to look at creativity. One of the other factors that people have looked at with respect to creativity is the kind of motivation towards doing a task. So, and this motivation can be looked at in 2 ways. An important component of creativity seems to be intrinsic motivation. How passionate towards the task you are yourself, how involved or engaged in the task you are just for the sake of the task. So, intrinsic motivation is basically the motivation to work on a task for its own sake, because you find it interesting, you want to spend time with that task, and because it is interesting to you, you will think of various ways, you will think of different new, novel, innovative, useful ways to actually complete that task. The task has to be exciting for you, it has to be personally challenging for you, and it should hold your interest for longer times. That is what intrinsic motivation is. Now, intrinsic motivation can be contrasted with extrinsic motivation. What is extrinsic motivation? Extrinsic motivation is when you are not really interested in doing that task, it does not really appeal to you so much, but you are doing that task because completing that task promises you certain reward or a certain raise or something like that. Now, a lot of research has been done to compare the 2 kinds of motivation and kind of look into creative and non-creative people and how these different motivations vary among these people. So, research has demonstrated that people are more likely to be creative when they are working on a task that they are truly interested in, that they truly enjoy. In one of the studies, Ronco and colleagues, they administered a standardized test of intrinsic motivation to college students. So, they administered this test and they come up with scores of intrinsic motivation. The test asked participants then to rate their level of interest in 3 kinds of activities: writing, art, and problem solving. Several weeks later, the students are again brought to the laboratory, and when they are asked to perform tasks in these 3 areas, and their performance in these tasks are now judged by trained judges who will judge their performance on whether these performances are creative or not creative. The results showed that the students with high intrinsic motivation scores on the test, suppose in high intrinsic motivation in art or high intrinsic motivation in writing or high intrinsic motivation in problem solving, were more likely to produce a creative project. So, they directly kind of correlated how intrinsically motivated you are and how creative your solutions are going to be. Many studies have also shown that students tend to produce less creative projects if they are working on these projects for external reasons. If you are just working for a high grade, if you are just working for getting a good salary, if you are just working for so that people may think good of you, then probably you are not really putting yourself in that task as much as you need to do. You might not excel in the task, you might not be able to be creative with that task. So, when people view a task as just being a means of earning a reward or a good grade or a positive evaluation, their extrinsic motivation is higher, and that kind of lowers down the intrinsic motivation. Consequently, as a result of this trade-off, their creativity is also likely to decrease. So, in a representative study, what they did was they asked the college students to write creative poems, and these people were told that their poems will be judged by a group of professional poets. So, because they are kind of the motivation is, the intrinsic motivation is not there, they are basically told that these professional poets will judge you and we might give you a reward if it is just highly creative or so on and so forth. And it was found that the college students wrote less creative poems when they were told that their poems are going to be judged than otherwise. Other research in a similar area also confirms these findings. The effects usually hold for both adults and children and for both artistic creativity and verbal creativity. So, motivation is a very important factor in whether you are going to be creative with a particular project or whether you are going to be able to creative in particular task or not. So, in general you can assume that extrinsic motivation reduces your creativity when it is controlling the limit and limiting your options. Is something very important to actually consider for both educators and employers as well, and also as well as students and workers. it's a very good idea to choose to work in an area that you intrinsically enjoy, that you intrinsically look forward to. You know, it's a good idea doing a job that you enjoy rather than doing a high paying job which you really, you know, don't enjoy at all. So that is probably all from me from creativity. It was just a small introduction into what creativity is about, and that kind of ends the 6th week. We'll see you in the 7th week with a different topic. Thank you.